Hello, everyone. I am finally back after about a year to bring you yet another episode of True Crime. I'm your host, Drue, and for this episode, I will be covering the very obscure story of a missing woman named Brookelyn Farthing. On June 21st, 2013, 18-year-old Brookelyn Farthing, who is also known as Brooke, and many of her other peers decided to attend an outdoor birthday party located in Berea, Kentucky, where they were also celebrating the beginning of another summer. Brooke had packed an overnight bag and had plans of staying the night with one of her friends, but as the party would continue on, eventually those plans of staying with her friend would fall through. So being that Brooke did not have a vehicle or a ride at the time, she would have to find another way home from the party. So while Brooke was still at the party, she then noticed that another one of her male classmates was very intoxicated and needed some assistance to get him home safely. So Brooke was then able to eventually find a guy at the party who was a few years older than her, and he was willing to give Brooke and her classmate a ride home. But what Brooke didn't know at this time was that by taking this ride from this man, it would ultimately put her into a bad situation that would later lead up to her disappearance. As the story unfolds, we learn that after Brooke and this man dropped off her classmate, they would then go back to his place that was just a few miles away from where the party was being held. Once they arrived at his home, Brooke then realized that this man's house had no water and no electricity, and at the time, the house was actually in foreclosure. So after being put into this creepy situation, Brooke then decided to get a hold of her sister for a ride home, but her sister was unable to come get her. So Brooke then decided to text her ex-boyfriend Jared for a ride home, but unfortunately, Jared was unable to come get her at the time due to the fact that he was already working his overnight shift, and that she would have to wait until he got off a few hours later. As her time went on in that house, Brooke became very scared about being there, and this has been proven by a series of texts that were sent from her phone to Jared. Once Jared was able to check his phone later on at work, the series of alarming texts suddenly turned into a few texts stating that she was now okay, and that she was now going to attend a party in a nearby county. But according to law enforcement and her family, no such party ever existed that night. And unfortunately, this would be the last text ever sent from Brooke's phone before she would eventually disappear. As the later morning hours approached on June 22nd, Brooke failed to meet up with one of her friends to attend a car show. So her friend called Brooke's family, but to their surprise, none of them had seen or heard from her other than just hours before when Brooke had asked her sister for a ride home. As the day progressed, Brooke's family was able to learn who Brooke was last with, and after contacting this man, this is where the whole story takes a very eerie turn. So please join me on the rest of this episode as I take a deeper dive into Brooke's story, and in this episode I will introduce who Brookelyn Farthing was, then I'll tell her story from the details I was able to gather during my research. Also reveal and talk more about who this man was that Brooke was with before she disappeared. And then to close out the episode, I will give my speculated theory and any of my final thoughts or opinions that I have about Brooke's still open case. Brooke's story is another one of these missing person cases where the information about this case leads you into believing that the writing is on the wall. But because of a lack of evidence thus far, both law enforcement and Brookelyn's family have not been able to quite prove who may have been responsible for Brookelyn's disappearance. It's now just been over 12 years since Brooke had disappeared from that home in Berea, Kentucky, and though many hours and extensive searches have been conducted in the search for Brooke, unfortunately, Brooke has never been found and still remains somewhere out there today. All her family wants is for her to come home one day, and by continuing to share Brooke's story, maybe one day they will finally receive the answers they deserve, and also be able to find some closure in all of this. This is True Crime. Episode 19, Brookelyn Farthing. Now, before I begin Brooke's story, I just want to remind everyone where I got all of my information for this episode and also where you can find all of my true crime episodes. Now, there are a few podcasts I recommend listening to if you want to learn even more about Brooke's case, and the first one you should check out is the Vanish podcast that was published back in 2017. And this particular podcast includes interviews from both Brooke's sister Tasha and law enforcement. The next two you should check out are Kentucky Gone Cold, which was published in 2022, and the Going West podcast, which was published more recently in 2023. If you're someone who has a subscription to HBO Max, I recommend checking out the series called Still a Mystery that covered Brooke's story very well, which also includes interviews with Brooke's family members, and Brooke's episode is on Season 1 and is the very first episode of this series. I was also able to find a few different articles out there that give information about Brooke's case, and these articles, plus the other sources I just spoke about, will all be listed in the episode description box. Now, I did reach out to both the Brookelyn Farthing Missing Facebook group and the FindBrookeFarthing.com website to confirm some details about this case, but unfortunately I did not receive a response from both sites, which is completely understandable, but it's always worth making an attempt to reach out to people who are close to the cases I cover. So you're probably going to hear me say "according to" a few times along the course of this episode. Now, real quick, I just wanted to let everyone know where you can find all of my Drue Crime episodes, and they can be found on any major platforms such as Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, YouTube, and many more. If you're someone who has any questions or would like to just discuss a case that I cover, feel free to message me on Facebook, Instagram, or you can even email me at drewcrimepodcast@gmail.com. One last thing, there has never been anyone charged with any crimes related to Brooke's disappearance, and anyone I do speak about in this episode is innocent of any wrongdoing unless proven otherwise. So with all of that out of the way, let's introduce who Brookelyn Farthing was. Brookelyn Shea Farthing, who again also went by Brooke to many, was born on August 19, 1994 in the small town of Berea, Kentucky, located in Madison County, where it's been said that everyone knows everyone. In 2023, the population of Berea was around 16,000 people, and the town is best known for its art festivals and historic restaurants and buildings. Berea is also the folk arts and crafts capital of Kentucky and is also home to Berea College, which is a private liberal arts college. Brooke was 18 years old at the time of her disappearance. She had just graduated from high school in 2013 in Berea, and she was the middle child of two other sisters, Tasha and Paige, to whom she lived with, and at the time they also all lived with her mother Shelby and their stepfather Randall as well, and from what I can see, the whole family has been big advocates in Brooke's disappearance. Brooke loved the color pink and she took good care of her appearance. It's been said that Brooke was a spunky, tell you how it is type of person, but also very lovable. It's also been said that she was the peacekeeper in the family, and that Brooke had dreams of one day becoming a cosmetologist. She was a lover of animals in the outdoors, to which she liked to fish and hunt as well. Brooke also dated a guy named Jared that I just mentioned before, and the two dated for about 3 years before they had broken up, and at some point during this time they had also lived together for about 1.5 years. Even though they had broken up, Brooke and Jared still remained civil and kept in contact with each other. One article I found during my research stated that Jared was an ex-fiancé, but that was the only article I found that claims this. So all in all, I was able to gather that Brooke seemed to be a good, fun-loving person who was liked by many, and I think this would later be confirmed after Brooke went missing when her phone received around 1,000 texts and calls from concerned family and friends. Now to start Brooke's story, I'm going to start on Friday, June 21st, 2013, which was the day before Brooke went missing. Earlier on that day, Brooke and her sister Paige took their driver's test and Brooke passed, but her sister did not. Later that afternoon, Brooke and her family would attend their grandfather's 70th birthday before then going to another birthday party later that night on Red Lick Road. So later that night, Brooke had arrived at the second birthday party with their sister Paige and their cousin, and it was also the beginning of another summer, so most of the teens in Berea had gathered together in a big field to celebrate. The party had a big bonfire, people were playing their music, dancing, drinking beers, while some of the other boys hung out on their tailgates. Even though one of Brooke's sisters and their cousin were also at the party, they would eventually decide to leave the party early on. Brooke had already packed an overnight bag because she had plans on staying with a friend of hers after the party, but later on her friend would end up deciding to leave the party with a boy, which in turn sparked an argument between the girls. So at this point, Brookelyn did not have a ride home from the party. So while Brooke was still at the party, she noticed a fellow classmate who I believe his name was Tyler, and he was very intoxicated and was not able to drive, so Brooke found someone to give her and Tyler a ride home. Joshua Hensley, who was 5 years older than Brooke, would end up being the man who gave Brookelyn a ride home from the party that night, and he also was a friend of her ex-boyfriend Jared. And I just wanted to point out here that none of Brooke's family members knew who Josh was at this time. Now, according to Brooke's sister on the Vanish podcast, Brooke and the two men left the party around 2 a.m., which is now Saturday the 22nd, and first the three of them went to a farm on Floyd Branch Road to ride horses. Then after that, Josh dropped Brooke's intoxicated classmate off at his house safely, and then Josh drove Brooke back to his house. Now, I did see in the Huffington Post article I found that reported on this case that investigators believe that Brooke allegedly drove her drunk classmate home in Josh's vehicle and then had to bring the vehicle back to Josh's house. And in my opinion, I think this makes more sense as to why Brooke would even end up at this guy's house that early morning, to which I will touch more on this again at the end of the episode when I give my speculated theory on Brooke's disappearance. Now, real quick, I just wanted to talk about Joshua Hensley before I move on in this story. Again, Josh is 5 years older than Brooke. He was friends or an acquaintance of Brooke's ex-boyfriend Jared, and at the time of Brooke's disappearance, Josh's house was located in a small rural neighborhood about 6 miles just outside the town of Berea in the 100 block of Dillon Court. And this neighborhood consisted of 8 or 9 houses that were surrounded by miles of wooded areas, and there's also a large lake nearby as well. Brooke's mother considered this area to be a safe place, and at the time, Brooke's Sunday school teacher even lived across the street from Josh. During this time, Josh's house was in foreclosure that had no electricity or running water, and also at this time, Josh had been going through a divorce. Josh was not a small guy, being listed at 6'3", 294 pounds, and this is according to his present-time inmate profile while being incarcerated for other heinous crimes, which includes 1 count of a use of a minor under 18 in a sexual performance, felony, 1 count of unlawful use of an electronic device to induce a minor of sexual activity, felony, and 1 count of possession of child pornography, which is also a felony. And he has been incarcerated since August of 2021, which was 8 years after Brooke went missing. And with good behavior, he could be released sometime in 2027, but for now, he is scheduled to be released in 2030. Now, normally I would have waited to share this type of information about a possible person of interest later on in the story, but I thought by sharing it now, you get a better understanding as to who Josh really is, and also what he's capable of doing, which in my opinion becomes important to know as I carry on during the rest of this episode. It's also good to know here that it's been stated by many people that during this time Josh was working in road maintenance for the county road department, so he knew the back roads of Berea very well, and you'll see why this could also be very important as the story carries on. Now, getting back to the story. So after dropping off her classmate, Brooke had arrived at Josh's place around 4 a.m., which again had no running water or electricity. Shortly after that, Brooke then decides to call her sister Paige to let her know she feels uncomfortable and wants to go home. Unfortunately, their cousin that Paige was with earlier was too drunk to drive, and since Paige didn't have a license, they were unable to come get Brooke. Paige offered to have someone else come pick her up, but Brookelyn declined and said that she would just wait for her ex-boyfriend Jared to come get her after he got off work, and also during this conversation, Brooke had asked Paige to leave the house door unlocked for her, to which later on her sister said she did, but unfortunately Brooke would never come home. Now at 4 a.m. Jared texted Brooke, "Everything cool?" And Brookelyn responded with, "Can you come pick me up now?" He responded that he would be done at work between 6 and 6:30 a.m. He then asked Brookelyn, "Will you be okay there until then?" And she responded, "Yeah, that's fine." Jared then asked Brookelyn, "Are you okay?" To which she responded, "I'm fine, had been drinking, but sobered up." She then went on to tell Jared that Josh was passed out in the bedroom and that she was just sitting on the couch smoking a cigarette. Then just a few minutes later at 4:26, Brooke texts Jared, "Can you hurry? Please hurry." And then she follows up that text with saying, "I'm scared." But at this point, Jared thinks Brooke is okay where she is at, so he had already gone back to work and doesn't check his phone until later on. When he does check his phone again, he notices these texts, and then he also notices a text at 5:30 a.m. to which Brooke texts him, "Never mind, I'm okay," followed by a text that says she's now going to a party in Rockcastle County, which is about 20 to 30 minutes south of where Brookelyn was. Jared then responds with the text, "Who with?" But Jared did not receive a response back from Brooke's phone, and that last text from her phone would actually be the last text that anyone would ever receive from Brooke's phone, ever again. Now, a few hours later around 9 a.m., Brooke didn't show up to meet with a friend named Matt for a car show that was being held in Somerset, Kentucky, which is about a 45-minute drive from Berea. Matt said he called Brooke many times, but she never picked up or called him back, and her friends were also calling Brooke during this time, and they too weren't receiving any answers. So I believe Matt or one of Brooke's friends then calls Brooke's family to let them know that Brooke didn't show up for the car show and that no one was able to get a hold of her. Brooke's mother said that this was very unlike Brooke to go this amount of time without contacting them about her whereabouts or what she was doing. So her family then contacts Jared to see if he knew anything about Brooke's whereabouts, and that's when he tells them about the text he had received from Brooke just hours before. Now, when it came to the text about the party, no one in Brooke's family had ever heard or saw anything about this supposed party in Rockcastle County, and they said that Brooke didn't even know anyone from that county. And they also found it very odd that she said that she was going to this party at 5:30 in the morning. In my opinion, it was also odd that Brooke's phone only texted Jared about going to this party in Rockcastle County, especially since she had just spoken with her sister about an hour or so before that last text, where Brooke never mentioned anything about going to a party. So after this, Brooke's family called around throughout the day and finally were able to find out who Brooke was last with, and this is when they were able to learn she had last been with Josh. And then they were able to acquire his phone number from someone else, so one of Brooke's sisters, Tasha, called him. Now, in the first of two phone calls between Tasha and Josh, Josh told her that Brooke had been at his place, and that he had known Brooke for a couple years, but again, her sisters or any of her family members had never heard of him. He then tells Tasha that he overheard Brooke talking about going to a party in Rockcastle County, to which they later find out that there's zero indication that this party ever existed. Then Josh proceeds to tell her that he felt uncomfortable at the house because of Brooke and Jared's previous relationship, so that's why he then left the house to go put his horses up, and when he came back to the house, Brooke was gone. So then Tasha tells Josh if they were unable to find her in the next little bit, that they would be contacting the police, and from my understanding, this is where the first phone call ends. Real quick here, if Josh felt so uncomfortable with Brooke being there due to Jared's past relationship with her, then why did he take her to his house early that morning that had no running water and no electricity anyways? It just doesn't make sense as to why Josh would even do this in the first place, other than that he had other intentions once they had arrived there. Now, according to Tasha on the Vanish podcast, Josh then calls Tasha back a little bit later on, and now he tells her that he is super nervous and worried. He then tells her that all of Brooke's belongings were still at his house, and Brooke's sister has said that Brooke was very protective of her belongings, so Tasha found it very odd that she would leave any of them behind. Tasha then asked Josh what were all of her belongings that she left behind, and he responded that he didn't know because he was looking at them through a hole in one of the windows into his home. And this was because there had been a fire at his house earlier that morning, which is quite literally appalling that he didn't even mention this fire in the first phone call. He then said he didn't know if Brooke did it or if the fire came from her smoking a cigarette on his couch. And then he told Tasha that when he had come back from tending to his horses, that's when he noticed the house was on fire, and that Brooke was gone. And this basically concluded the second phone call, and there were no more phone calls between the two. So after this second phone call between Josh and her, Tasha then said she called Brooke's phone several more times, but again, she received no response from Brooke. One other thing I found interesting while conducting my research is that in 2020, a news channel covered Brooke's story, and the news anchor stated that, according to reports, Josh told law enforcement that Brooke was asleep on his couch when he left to tend to his horses, and then when he returned, the house was on fire. The reason I bring this up here is it's pretty obvious that Josh's story has changed already a few different times when it comes to the time frame of him leaving his house to put up his horses. One story he tells, he says Brooke was smoking on the couch, and in this other story he now claims she was asleep on the couch. So the fact is, both stories can't be true, so it really leads me to believe Josh is definitely hiding something here. So now to backtrack a little bit here, it turns out that earlier that morning on the 22nd at 7 a.m., Josh did call 911 to report a fire in his living room. Firefighters responded to the call to find a burned out couch in the living room, but this was the only part of the house that had caught fire. And it just so happened to be the last place Josh says he saw Brooke before he left to tend to his horses. All that was left from this fire was the metal frame of the couch and a huge burn hole in the floor from where the couch was sitting. I also wanted to note here that Josh never told firefighters that morning that someone else had been in the house earlier that morning, which I'm sure to many people is very suspicious, being again that this is the last place Brooke had been seen. And according to an ABC News article, firefighters at the scene deemed the circumstances of this fire as being suspicious. Also, according to this article, an arson investigator said that it's not common for a fire to start without electricity, and we all now know that Josh's house had none. Now, according to the National Fire Protection Association, smoking materials including cigarettes are responsible for approximately 5% of residential fires. And while this percentage may seem low compared to other causes like cooking or heating, smoking-related fires are a leading cause of fire deaths. In fact, smoking was the leading cause of home fire deaths in the US for the period of 2012 to 2016, and coincidentally, this fire occurred in 2013. So after reading this, I think it's fair to say that smoking-related fires are very uncommon, even though they do occur. Now, with that being said, according to the Going West podcast, Josh later on told Brooke's family and law enforcement that he believes Brooke must have fallen asleep while smoking a cigarette on the couch and set herself on fire by accident, which to me is pretty interesting given the fact that none of this was mentioned to Brooke's sister in any of the earlier phone calls. Now, as for the couch itself, it was not processed for blood or human remains until later on because Brooke had not yet been reported missing. I'm personally not sure if they found anything on that couch relating to Brooke, being that the details of the fire are very limited due to the fact that this is still an open case. But if law enforcement did find something that suggested Brooke did in fact set herself on fire on this couch, I'm sure there's a good chance they wouldn't have been out searching for her and her phone, which were the only two things missing from the scene, to which I will mention more about here next. So after learning about the fire, Brooke's family then went over to Josh's house, which was now being treated as a crime scene. And all that remained of Brooke was her belongings that consisted of her cowboy boots, her purse, and her overnight bag. Again, the only two things that were missing were Brooke and her phone. So the big questions here are, where would Brooke have gone all by herself? And even if she did have something to do with this fire, why would she leave most of her belongings behind and then just disappear into thin air while having zero contact with anyone close to her after the fact? It's not like Josh's entire house was on fire. It was literally just in the area of where Josh says he last saw Brooke, which was on the couch. And if she did set herself on fire on that couch like Josh believes, there would be some kind of evidence that suggests that. Plus, like I'd mentioned before, at the time, Brooke's Sunday school teacher lived across the street from Josh, and I feel that if she didn't set herself on fire and was panicking and fled his house, all she had to do was run over there, let alone call anyone else for help, being that she had her phone. Or did something bad happen to her inside that house and a fire was set to get rid of any evidence, and that's why no one ever heard from her ever again? And I will be talking a little more about this towards the end of the episode when I give my speculated theory on Brooke's story. So after Brooke went missing, her family then reported her missing, and then they continued to call Brooke's phone, and her phone rang for the next 2 to 3 days before it stopped ringing. Now, this is a part that I found a little confusing because according to the Huffington Post article and some of my other sources, authorities contacted Farthing's cell phone carrier and determined her phone last pinged on a tower in a nearby town called Blue Lick, which is about 30 miles away from where Farthing was last seen, and the phone has not been turned on since. But it's also been said by a few other people that her phone was pinging nearby to where she last was. And according to a username named Oki on Web Sleuths, they seem to recall that this tower Brooke's phone last pinged from is located about 3,000 feet south of the intersection of Blue Lick Road and Johnson Road, which is about 4.2 miles northwest of where Josh's house was located. Now, the host of the Vanish podcast also said that her phone pinged from a tower nearby to where she was last seen, but the host did not give a specific distance. So I'm not quite sure if the host considered 30 miles close by, or if she was talking about a different ping, such as the one Oki from Web Sleuths is talking about, which again was much closer to where Brooke was last seen. Now, from what I have read, cellular towers can be replaced or even demolished, and if they are replaced, they're usually replaced by a new one in the same vicinity, and if some towers are demolished, it could be because they're no longer needed in a particular area. So I guess it is possible that at some point a tower did exist in the area Oki was talking about, but is now no longer there. And that could be why I was unable to find a tower in that vicinity using a cellular tower locator map. Either way, if anyone listening can help me clear this part up, please contact me through my email I listed earlier, or leave me a comment on this episode found on my YouTube channel. Now, from what Brooke's sister Tasha has said on the Vanish podcast, law enforcement told the family to search in about a 3-mile radius around this tower, but some things are easier said than done due to the nature of this terrain. Now, in the coming days, law enforcement and volunteers did conduct extensive searches looking for Brooke, and when all was said and done, they covered around 16,000 acres of difficult terrain, which is about a radius of 2.5 miles. And these areas were dense and thick wooded, there were steep cliffs, rocks, sinkholes, and the areas even included dangerous animals such as copperheads and rattlesnakes. Right around the area where Brooke initially went missing, law enforcement had brought in horses, helicopters, cadaver dogs, and even divers to search nearby ponds in that area. They also checked out secluded areas, abandoned wells, and back roads that had poor cell phone coverage, but to no avail, they weren't able to find anything that was linked to Brooke's disappearance. Also, Brooklyn's ex-boyfriend Jared was brought in for questioning later on, but he had an airtight alibi that night because it was confirmed he was at work during everything. Joshua Hensley was also questioned along with everyone else that attended the outdoor party from that night. Now, I had just mentioned that a user named Oki on Web Sleuths who says they used to live in the area back in the 80s and that seemed to recall they had information about where the last ping from Brooke's phone came from, to which again, I'm not quite sure about this, being that I wasn't able to find a cell phone tower on a cell tower map located in the vicinity of what he was talking about. But this person also added some other information in their post that I found quite interesting, and so I wanted to go ahead and read it to you really quick before I start to wrap up this episode. In Oki's post, they also said, go to Google Earth and look at the area bounded by Highway 21 on the north, Highway 421 on the east, and Burnt Ridge Road on the south. In globe view mode, you can see a lot of detail and you can see how rugged and thickly wooded the area is. Those two lakes you see are in a holler called Cowbell Hollow. That whole patch of woods is owned by Berea College and is closed to the general public, no access. This is only speculation, but I've always suspected that he, meaning Josh, disposed of her remains somewhere in there. The chances of someone such as a hunter or a hiker finding remains accidentally there are extremely remote, given that there is no public access. But a local boy would know where to hide something there. Also, and this hasn't been brought up anywhere, as far as I know, just below the summits of hills in that area, particularly along Highway 421, there is a limestone formation that is chock full of deep, narrow shafts that are open at the top, but hard to see. If you hike in that area, you have to be careful to avoid falling into one. If a body were dropped down into one of those, it would never be found. I've thought about going there to peer into those shafts that I could find, but I'd have to trespass to do it. So after reading this post and looking at the area Oki was talking about, I do think it could be a strong possibility that someone could have disposed of Brooke's body somewhere in that vicinity, given the lack of access and the limited visibility of much of this terrain, and the fact that the area was not far from Josh's house. Oki also mentioned that a local boy would know where to hide something there. And now, given what we know about Joshua Hensley, who worked for the county road department, and knowing these areas well, plus all of his sex crimes he was convicted on, I start to wonder if Josh may have possibly been responsible for Brooke's disappearance, but due to the lack of evidence at his house, law enforcement just doesn't have enough to pursue him further, other than the few times Brooke's family has been told that they spoke with him. Now, with that being said, I'd like to give my speculated theory on what I think may have happened to Brookelyn Farthing, and then I'll end the episode with any final thoughts. Again, nobody that I have mentioned in this episode has been charged with any crimes relating to Brooke's disappearance, and anyone mentioned is considered innocent unless proven otherwise. And again, my theory is based on pure speculation, while using the facts derived from my research and statements that I've heard from Brooke's family members that are out there. So to start my speculated theory, we have to start towards the beginning of this story when Brooke and her intoxicated classmate took a ride home from Joshua Hensley. As the story goes, the three of them went to ride horses, then they dropped off Brooke's classmate safely at home, and then made their way to Josh's residence. Now, the whole time I was researching this case, I never really could understand why after Brooke and Josh dropped off her classmate at his house, that Josh couldn't just take Brooke home after that. Was Brooke's house just too out of the way? Did he tell her he had more booze at his place and they were going to party more with other people? Or did Josh have intentions of getting with Brooke, given the fact that she had already been drinking, which can sometimes make people more vulnerable? Whatever the reason may have been, I have to go back to the Huffington Post article I mentioned much earlier in this episode. Now again, according to this article, Brooke's stepdad was led to believe that investigators speculated that Brooke must have dropped Josh off first at his house, then she went and dropped off her classmate at his house, and since she had Josh's vehicle, she then had to return to Josh's residence on Dillon Court to drop the car off, which ultimately left her stranded at Josh's place with no ride. And I do think this makes the most sense as to how Brooke ended up at Josh's after the big party. Also, Josh has said that he felt uncomfortable about being at his house alone with Brooke due to the fact that Jared and Brooke had a previous relationship. So if that's the case, why didn't he just take Brooke home in the first place? So it seems the next thing Brooke did after arriving at Josh's was to find her own way home. And that's when she called her sister Paige for a ride, but unfortunately her sister and cousin were unable to come get her. Now this part confuses me a little bit because later on, after they couldn't find Brooke, they didn't have any idea that she was at Josh's house just hours before. But Brooke had spoken with her sister around 4 a.m. So I'm assuming Brooke didn't tell Paige where she was while she was asking for a ride, and I certainly may have missed something along the way in my research, but either way, it's not a big deal given that they were able to find out later on that Brooke was in fact at Josh's house before she disappeared. So after speaking with her sister, Brooke then decides to text her ex-boyfriend Jared to come get her, but since he was at work, she would have to wait a few hours. Also, I just wanted to point out here again that her ex-boyfriend did have an airtight alibi that night, and he really was at work during this time. So during Brooke's time at Josh's, she starts to become uneasy about being there, and this has been confirmed by the text she starts to send Jared around 4:26 a.m. that includes "hurry, please hurry," and "I'm scared." Well, according to what we know now, Jared was working and didn't see these texts until later on when he checked his phone again at work. So then at 5:30 a.m., Brooke changes her tune and texts Jared, "Never mind, I'm okay," followed by a text that says she's going to a party in Rockcastle County, to which Jared responds with "who," and then he never gets a response back from Brooke. Now, I know a lot of people are probably thinking here, well, why didn't Jared go over after work and check on her, given some of the text he had received from Brooke earlier on? And to tell you the truth, I'm not sure why he decided not to go make sure she was okay, but I also can't think or speak for Jared as well. I'm sure once it was decided that she was missing, he probably felt bad about not doing so. But at the same time, he probably thought she had been drinking that night and now just wanted to continue the party elsewhere. Now, when it comes to these last two texts that were sent from Brooke's phone at 5:30 a.m., I do speculate that those two texts did not come from Brooke herself. Again, after she arrived at Josh's place, she was trying to get a ride home, and I feel that if she was wanting to go to a party in Rockcastle County, she would have mentioned this to her sister when they spoke on the phone around 4 a.m. Plus, Brooke never texted or called any of her other friends that weren't at Josh's to accompany her to this party, and like I've mentioned a few times already in this episode, there is zero evidence that this party ever existed, and Brooke didn't even know anybody in Rockcastle County, according to one of her sisters. Also, after Brooke disappeared, this was a pretty big story locally, let alone nationally, and later on there were billboards put up about her disappearance and vigils being held. So I feel that if there was a party in Rockcastle County, by now someone at this supposed party would have come forward to confirm this. But to this day, no one has ever said they saw Brooke at a party that night, let alone that this party ever even occurred. Now, given Josh's history with sexual felonies and the fact that he was going through a divorce at the time, I do think it's very possible that he started to come on to Brooke while she was sitting on his couch smoking a cigarette. I do speculate that Brooke may have denied his passes, and this did not sit well with Josh, so it's very possible he may have assaulted Brooke on the couch, and she then became a victim of circumstance. Then after a possible assault occurred, I do think it's also then possible that Josh started the fire on the couch to rid of any evidence, but before the fire was set, I speculate Brooke was taken out of the home and left somewhere else, and I think this could help explain why her belongings and shoes were left behind, and possibly why her phone last pinged from the Blue Lick cell tower, which again was about 30 miles west of Berea. In my opinion, had Brooke gone to a party in Rockcastle County, which was 20 to 30 minutes south from where she was, that phone would have probably pinged at some point in a different area. But I do have to say here that I'm not an expert on phone pinging and certainly could be wrong, because depending on various factors, phones may not always ping to their closest towers. Also, it does make sense to me that Brooke's phone left the house with Brooke because A, it shows that she left Josh's home, and B, it was her only line of communication, and if anyone she knew tried to get a hold of her during this time, this would allow her assailant to keep track of anyone who chose to do so. I do feel at this point, time was of the essence and everything needed to be done rather quickly. Then I speculate after Brooke was removed from the home that Josh arrived back to his house and started the fire on the couch, again getting rid of any evidence that might be present. And after the couch was pretty much torched, he then called the fire department to report a fire around 7 a.m. and the house was already in foreclosure, so I'm sure he wouldn't care about the damage, even though you can be held liable for doing so. And all of this just so happened to be around the same time Jared would be getting off work. And anyone who had access to Brooke's phone would know that just by looking at Brooke and Jared's text conversation. Now, I do have to mention here again that law enforcement has never released any details about the fire due to the fact it is still an open case. So it does become very difficult to say how this fire was started in the first place. Now, I also don't know about Josh's movements later on in the day after the fire had occurred, but I do think it's possible that he could have been able to retrieve wherever he may have left Brooke and disposed of her in another area, where no one would think to look and find her. And also, possibly at some point, separating Brooke from her phone to throw off any trail. Remember, he knew the county area and the back roads very well, and if he needed to get rid of Brooke's body and phone later on, he could have done so in a timely fashion. So in conclusion to this speculated theory and this episode, I don't believe Brooke left on her own accord to just disappear. because there is zero evidence to suggest this. And again, she had already made arrangements with her ex-boyfriend Jared to get a ride home from Josh's after Jared got off work, and she also had already made plans to meet a friend for a car show later on that morning. However, I do speculate Josh most likely had something to do with Brooke's disappearance, especially since his story changed about how the last time he saw Brooke before he left his house to put up his horses. The fact I haven't heard or read anything about Josh helping the family find Brooke, and the fact Josh never mentioned to the firefighters that someone else was inside his home before the fire even started. But like I said, there's just not enough evidence right now to implicate him in her going missing, so hopefully one day law enforcement and the family are able to find some kind of clues that can help solve Brooke's case. But at this point, I do feel that the last person who was with Brooke is the only person that can help answer all of the questions that her family, friends, law enforcement, and supporters have had for all of these years. Law enforcement has told Brooke's stepdad that they have been following any leads and have an idea of what may have happened to Brooke, but law enforcement hasn't yet told them what they believe did happen. At the time of her disappearance, Brookelyn Farthing was 5'1", 110 pounds with blonde hair and brown eyes. And it's been said that she was wearing a gray t-shirt from the Madison County Future Farmers of America and also a pair of denim shorts. I believe there is still a $14,000 reward for any information leading to Brooke's whereabouts, so if you or anyone that you know has any information about Brookelyn Farthing's disappearance, please contact the Kentucky State Police at 859-623-2404 or visit and send a message on the Facebook group page Missing Brookelyn Farthing or at the findbrookefarthing.com website. Now, I do want to go ahead and thank everyone who made it to the end of this episode, and I also want to thank everyone who has stayed subscribed to my podcast, even after my little year hiatus that I just had. Thank you again for tuning in to another episode of Drue Crime. I will definitely see all of you again here in the next few weeks, and my always friendly reminder to everyone, love everyone, but trust no one. I am your host, Drue V, and you've just heard another episode of Drue Crime.